Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me start by just saying how delighted I am to be here. Very much looking forward to what looks like a fantastic agenda over the course of the next 2 days. And also, I guess, to acknowledge it's a difficult job I have, which is to follow Mike, is always a difficult ask. So what I'm going to do is spend just the next 10 or 15 minutes giving you a bit of background to the Grand Challenge Initiative, and also talk through some of the logistics, if you like, where we are, the process that we've evolved, the teams that we have now funded, and where we are on that journey. So this all started for us back in about 2014, really, where as part of our strategy review, CRUK really challenged itself with thinking about how we could be bolder, how we could really think about a different concept that would make a big impact in terms of cancer research. We challenged ourselves with thinking about how we identified what the big challenges might be, but also about how we as a funder could think very differently about how we would support you as a community in addressing those challenges. Even in that thinking, we recognised that the scope of this was broad. It would have to include basic, translational, clinical, and population in terms of the content and the thinking that we might bring to this. And although it might not seem like a big deal, that the top right here was a big step for us in recognising that this was not a national endeavour. So at that point, CRUK primarily focused within the UK, and a big strategic shift for us was to recognise that this had to be international. It had to be driven through collaboration, and it had to fund the best science wherever it might be within the world. We kind of also recognised that with this different thinking, we had to think at a different scale. This wasn't about just thinking in terms of the next programme grant or the next project grant. It was really about how we could bring a different level of funding that would support a fundamentally different way of working, that would enable scientists to think outside of the constraints of typical funding streams and to think about how we could fundamentally challenge some of these biggest challenges in cancer, which was really what sat behind the thinking that got us to a £20 million award for Grand Challenge. And again, right from the very start, we also acknowledged that, as well as collaboration across the scientific community, this was an initiative that we really wanted to drive collaboration at a philanthropic and at a funder level as well, so that we could work in partnership with other organisations to make this as big a success as we could. So with all of that kind of conceptual thinking, back in 2014, we started this initiative and we convened the Grand Challenge Advisory Panel to help us evolve that thinking and to help us deliver this initiative. So this is the current scientific panel, and of course, as you'd expect, this has changed, evolved over the past 4 or 5 years. But as you can see, I'm not going through the list of people. It's a real stellar list of world-class scientists. We have a broad range of expertise on there. And this panel is really responsible for a whole host of things. They certainly provide us strategic guidance on the broader issues around the initiative, but they're also responsible for convening all the thinking, if you like, around the different themes that the broader consultation brings together, helping us define what those challenges might be, and then actually converting the themes and the ideas into the specific questions that form the Grand Challenge questions. And of course, their final and critical role is also in then selecting which applications get funded and taken forward as successful programmes. So in terms of current status and where we are as of today, I think the honest truth for CRUK is this is still early. This is a long-term endeavour for us, and it's a bit of an experiment. But notwithstanding that, I think we're already pretty much convinced that this has been transformational in terms of the way that we fund science. It's a unique opportunity as far as we're aware, specifically in terms of the cancer funding research landscape. And so far we've funded 7 teams across 2 separate rounds, covering a whole range of different scientific areas, and actually that equates to about £130 million worth of funding across 9 different countries. Interestingly, those teams and the £130 million has also really driven that collaborative philanthropic and co-funding mechanism that we talked about earlier. So actually, we've been able to leverage, if you like, about 30% of that commitment through partnership with other organisations, and I'll speak to that in a few slides' time. I think we have iterated and developed the process as we've gone. We've tried to listen to the community in terms of things that do work and things that don't work. And importantly, we've really taken this outside of our routine funding stream and funding process. We've tried to streamline, we've tried to make it agile, we've tried to make it effective for applicants as well as for CRUK. And as I've said, what we've already, I think, started to see is that this is funding science that's outside of people's normal stream. It's not just a next project, it is different thinking, and it's enabling different types of science. So we really do believe and expect that we will see novel and innovative and interesting science emerging as part of this programme. So just to tell you a little bit more about the selection process, as I said, one of those kind of key concepts was that the grand challenges themselves would come from the community. So over the course of the 2 rounds and the 3rd round that's coming, we're doing a very broad consultation. So this involved a number of workshops, going out and speaking with a broad range of scientists, public, patients, and actually getting a whole long list, if you like, of different potential grand challenges. As I've already said, the panel then helped us whittle those down and group them into different thematic areas. And actually, I think, having heard them talk about this many times, one of the difficult things is then how you take a thematic area and construct that into a grand challenge, something that is sufficiently ambitious, but also something that is achievable, something which has sufficient focus around a theme, but also has sufficient breadth and doesn't restrict how people might think differently about adapting their way of working to address those challenges. So a really difficult job, and one which they have done a fantastic job around. So then in terms of the process, we asked for people to submit a short expression of interest, again thinking about keeping the workload relatively low. And through that initial process, we've then triaged down to 9 or 10, and we can do a few more, we can do a few less, but in the first 2 rounds it's worked out at 9 or 10. And we give them £30,000, which is really for each of those teams to then convene a broader consortia to think about how they work up the application. And it's really to give them enough money that they can make the best attempt at the application, the full application, as is possible. So each of those shortlisted teams then comes forward with a full application, and of course we invite them in and we have an interview in front of the panel where they present as a consortia, as a team, their vision for the grand challenge question with which they wish to address. The panel then selects the winning team or teams, and of course then we issue the grant and the work proceeds. And I guess what we've really tried to do through this process as well is acknowledge that it is a big effort and it is a big piece of work. And even where there have been some applications that haven't quite made the final success, if you like, we have been able to then follow up and see if there are individual parts of that programme that might be open to different routes of funding through CRUK or others. So very quickly, just to give you a sense of numbers and metrics, round 1, we had 57 expressions of interest across 25 countries and about 436 investigators. So that was our first round, which I think was a fantastic success for us. On the back of funding 4 instead of 1, which was the initial intent for CRUK, and we've obviously provoked a huge international interest in the Grand Challenge initiative. And we saw at the second round that saw a very significant jump up to 134 expressions of interest across 41 countries and with over 1,500 different investigators involved in that process. So a really fantastic response, and again the fact that we've been able to hit 41 countries as CRUK, who've historically really only funded within the UK, I think is a real testament to how this has been received by the scientific community globally. Again, I haven't really got time to go through these in detail, but just to give you a reminder, if you like, of the 7 questions that we set in round 1. Clearly one of those will be very familiar to this room. We actually funded 4 programmes across 3 of the different questions, and the teams from round 1 are on this slide. So we had the Rosetta team, which again is very interesting. So Josephine Bunch is an EPS scientist. She's not someone who would have typically come to CRUK for funding. It's a different community to the one with which we typically interact. And she brought some very different thinking to how they might address this grand challenge. We've got the IMAX team, who's Greg Hannon, clearly is one of our scientists, but again, the size and scale of this programme enabled them to think very differently about how they might try and understand the complexity of physical interactions within and around the tumour and how that impacts the disease. I'm not going to speak to Mutographs for obvious reasons, but finally from the first round, Professor Jelle Westling and the Precision team, and this was really a question of how they could start to understand patients with DCIS and which of those patients would or would not progress to full-blown breast cancer. And can we kind of start addressing the lethal versus non-lethal question? Can we reduce over-treatment, and can we pick and stratify the patients that might require or best respond to therapy? So round 2, we actually set 8 instead of 7 questions this time, and for the ones who can remember these things will see that just one of the questions carried over. So it was, we never set any rules around whether we would or we wouldn't keep some of the questions, but we felt like for round 2 there were sufficient new questions that we could refresh them all. And the reason we kept lethal versus non-lethal was really just because even though we'd funded a team in that space at the first round, it was very specific related to breast, and we felt that that's a broad question that did have scope for potential in other areas and other indications. As it turns out, we didn't fund another program in that area anyway. So the 3 teams that we funded at round 2, the specific cancer team, and this is quite an interesting concept really for them to try and understand why driver mutations or driver events have different specificity within different tissues in the body. So why does BRCA only cause cancer in certain types, not all types of human tissue? So again, some interesting concepts to come through there. We have the storming team with Thea Tilsey, and this is really about the impact of chronic inflammation and how we kind of better understand and potentially find ways to treat chronic inflammation and how that impacts on cancer progression and development within the body. And finally, Matt Meyerson and Wendy Garrett in the optimistic team. And again, another fascinating program looking to understand the microbiome and how that might impact and affect colorectal cancer specifically, both in its progression, development, and also, of course, in the potential treatment. So again, some great teams, and you'll notice that this time around, all 3 teams were actually led from the US. They're all international, they all have multi-country providers and supporters, but are all 3 based in the US at the last round. And to that point, I think what we are really pleased with in terms of the grand challenge is this international community that we've been able to build. So, of course, what we see is within individual teams, they're all international applications, and what a great example here today in terms of the number of different countries that are represented in the room. But remember, this is just within the one challenge team, the Mutograph team. If we replicate that across all 7 of our teams, we really have now started to build an international community, and every year we're convening parts of the teams together so that they can share their expertise, share their thinking, share their problems, identify new synergies, new opportunities for collaboration, and that's proving to be a really positive part of the process. So kind of final 2 slides that I wanted just to bring back to, again, around the theme of collaboration, but also, as Mike mentioned, the kind of importance of patient involvement. So right up front, we very clearly articulated that patients or patient advocates had to be a really critical part of this. So we've integrated them and involved them throughout the entirety of the process. We had patient advocates at the workshops helping to set and think about questions, grand challenge questions, right from the beginning. We have a patient advisory panel who have helped us identify and create PPI and PPE guidelines for the teams, providing advice to applicants. And we also have a representative sat on the panel as part of that decision-making process, which has been a fantastic and important part of the process for us. And then finally, again, as Mike mentioned, each of the teams actually has PPI or PPE fully embedded within the teams, and it is forming part of the daily working of these teams in terms of how they proceed, how they develop. And then finally, again, I mentioned the collaborative effort, which is really pervasive throughout all different parts of Grand Challenge. But the 2 I just wanted to flag specifically is these kind of 2 different organisations that we've been able to co-fund some of the Grand Challenges through. And of course, this is important because yes, CRUK are a large organisation. Yes, we're lucky to have significant resources. But even for an organisation as big as CRUK, we can't fund all the great science that we would like to do. So we really do need to work in partnership with organisations like the KWF, who are co-funding the Precision team based out of the Netherlands, and the Mark Foundation, who are co-funding the Specific Answer team based in the US. Both organisations have fully bought into the kind of ethos and the concept of Grand Challenge. They're both fantastic organisations that we've really enjoyed working with, and we hope to work with them going forwards. And of course, we hope to work with other organisations as well. So I'm going to pause there. I am around for the full 2 days, so if anybody wants to have a chat or has any questions, not for now, I'll be around and happy to speak with anyone as we go, but thank you for that.